This film tells the story of an expedition to East Africa in which most of the members were between 18 and 21 years of age. It was one of a number of expeditions organized over the past 15 years by the Brathay Exploration Group in many different parts of the world. In the Lake District, we have a base from which 5 or 6 expeditions operate every year. At the same time, another 5 or 6 expeditions are at work in countries overseas. These are manned by boys who have already had some experience with the group or at the Brathay Hall Centre. Every expedition has definite scientific objectives, usually in the fields of geography, ornithology, botany, or archaeology. Every expedition is also a partnership between those with some experience in exploration and field studies and those keen to learn. But more than this, it is a partnership between boys drawn from widely different backgrounds in schools and industry. The Uganda expedition went a stage further. In this joint British-African venture, 12 boys from England and 10 African schoolboys, working together, were able to do some really worthwhile exploration and so open the way for similar cooperation in the future.
As we set out with our porters on the ascent of Mount Elgon, we seemed to have all the ingredients for the popular idea of an expedition. As we climbed, we passed through plantations of banana trees, which were soon followed by the forest itself. Map reading was little use in a place like this, and we were entirely dependent on our guide. The most impressive thing about the forest was its size, not only in breadth and depth, but also in height. Great trees reaching 80 or 90 feet above us and shutting out the sunlight and even the rain. It was a pretty tough climb, and a rest every 2 hours gave us a few brief moments to take stock of our surroundings. It was all so new, not only to us, but also to the African schoolboys. They had come from 7 different secondary schools in Uganda and Kenya. This was a mission school near Mbale, and it was from here that the expedition divided into 3 groups for the survey work. The expedition leader was Yoan Thomas, a schoolmaster from Oundle, who had spent a year in Uganda doing research. Brian Tricker from Eton, talking to Benjamin O'Look. The deputy leader was Jack Bass of Rugby, one of the founder members of the Brathay Exploration Group. And this is Samuel Ayadu from King's College, Gudo. We had 2 days of hectic preparation in the towns, then we were off. We had been warned that if it's been raining, the road to Elgon is likely to be sticky. At first, the going was easy, and we passed lorries loaded with sugar cane, which is quite an important industry in this region. Nearer the mountains, we nearly ran into a group of people with bells on their ankles, taking the youths to a secret place for initiation ceremonies. Well, it had been raining, and the hill, although smooth and firm, was very greasy. It took the combined help of all our party and some of the nearby villagers to get us going again. Our climb brought us up to country which was more like the South Downs than the tropics. At about 10,000 feet on the slopes of Mount Elgon, the forest begins to thin out, giving clearings which are used as cattle pastures. It was here that a tribe of the Sabay people live in their unusual flat-roofed houses, with stockades round the entrance to keep out the wild animals. We had come here to make a survey of their buildings and way of life. But first we had to pay off our porters. According to custom, they stood next to the packs they had brought up, and Yoan Thomas paid each one his fee. Each pack weighed about 50 pounds, and they had carried them up the mountain in half the time we had taken. We had a deep respect for the strength of those porters, and the handshake represented real gratitude for all they had done. We had been told that the mountain people might be reluctant to meet us, but instead we found them very friendly. Only one of our party understood their native language, but this did not prevent us from getting on very well with them. Our portable tape recorder with a few recordings of traditional jazz helped to arouse their interest, and it was not long before they were giving us some of their performances to take back. Detailed aerial photographs provided the basis for our survey of the flat houses. In some clearings, they seemed to be changing over to the more well-known round houses, and we were anxious to have a record, before it's too late, of what are probably the only houses of this kind in the world. It would be a great step forward if their hospitality extended to inviting us into the stockade and into the house itself. And again, we found the tape recorder a great help in making friends, especially when Grandma was able to hear her own voice. Then at last came the invitation. Each house is 60 feet long and shelters one family unit of up to 20 people. It was too dark to film inside, but O'Cott, one of the expedition members, was able to make some sketches. At the far end is an entrance to a separate part of the building, which is used as a stable for the sheep and cattle. We found the mud almost impossible to avoid and a great nuisance, but at least it reminded us that mud was one of the basic building materials for these houses. The woman of the household also had a use for this mud in her weekly task of keeping the roof in good order. The whole building consists of a mesh of bamboo staves and branches with mud plastered on. The mud on the roof is anything up to 9 inches thick, which is quite weighty and accounts for the heavy vertical beams. When the inside had been fully investigated, we turned our attentions to measuring up the outside of the house. One thing we learned in this process was that ordinary Wellingtons are far better footwear than a pair of mountaineer's boots. In spite of language problems, we were really beginning to find out quite a lot about the place. These are beehives. It must have taken many hours of work to hollow out one of these logs. The empty ones are stored in the porch of the house and later on placed high up in the fork of a tree. The Sabay people live chiefly on maize, which they buy in the valley in exchange for their cattle. They store the maize in these round bins with conical tops, which are raised above ground level to keep out damp and rats. The maize is turned into flour in the Atlas grinding machine made in England, the only manufactured article they use. This creature is half mole and half rat, and can be quite fierce. They are trapped and eaten by the Sabay people, but our interest was a little more detached, and the ones we caught ended up dissected in the British Museum. Our base on Mount Elgin was a rather dilapidated mud and wattle government rest house. It was far less homely than the flat houses, and we only used it as a shelter for cooking and eating. For everything else, we were either out of doors or in our tents. We had a regular visit each day from these two, and they probably found out at least as much about us and our strange ways as we were able to find out about them. In the end, we bought the chicken, and it made a very good meal. In spite of the heavy rain that fell for a short while every day, our nearest water supply was half an hour from camp and had to be boiled anyway. We therefore rigged up a spare ground sheet to collect an extra supply from the roof of the rest house. It was quite a success, but young Thomas, who was a biologist and saw germs everywhere, felt that we should boil that too. Probably it was just as well, for no one had any stomach troubles, as we had half expected. Most of the men carried bows and arrows, and David Blackett was soon persuading some of them to sell arrows at 1 shilling and bows for 3 shillings. It was not long before they were giving us a course of instruction and plenty of after-sales service. They were a little reluctant to join in a competition, but they did not mind watching us make fools of ourselves. We never had the opportunity of seeing them use arrows against a moving target, though they did occasionally do so to protect their flocks of sheep and cattle. We heard that they even have to use them occasionally against the mountain leopard. The nearest we ever got to a leopard was some pretty recent tracks, and that was near enough in thick woods. Near the summit of Mount Elgin, we saw these giant groundsel, over twice as high as any of us. This is one of the few places in the world where they grow. This is the vast crater at the top, for Mount Elgin was once an enormous active volcano, whose base was more than 60 miles across. While some of the expedition were at work on Mount Elgin, others had travelled on to the Karamoja region, looking for fossils, while a third group, camping at Ngora, studied rock formations. This is an Inselberg, a massive outcrop of rock rising some 300 feet with virtually no vegetation at all except at the base. Some are just plain steep-sided domes. Others are overhanging on most sides and almost impossible to climb. One of these was Tank Rock, near the village of Ngora, but someone had to climb it in order to carry out the survey. Douglas Stables was now in his element, but there were not many people who tried or even wanted to follow him to the very edge of this one. The object of this work was to carry out precise observations on a number of Inselbergs as a contribution towards solving the problem of how they were formed. We found monkeys living in hollows among these Inselbergs, but long ago they had been inhabited by Stone Age bushmen, and our digging and measuring helped to bring in information about them. But the most spectacular evidence left by them was the paintings on the walls. These seemed to be of canoes and a series of circular designs. We copied these paintings by putting a great polythene sheet on the wall and tracing with felt pens. The meaning of the circles is not known. They may be sundials or a map of the area with circles representing Inselbergs. In the village, people were coming in from all the surrounding area and getting ready for a great dancing competition. We were guests of honor and had a grandstand view in the middle of all that went on. Later on, as part of the afternoon, we fielded a team to play the locals at football. They couldn't have had much energy left after all that dancing, but nevertheless, they managed to beat us pretty soundly. By the middle of August, work at Ngora was complete, and arrangements were made to move a group northwards to Patiko. Meanwhile, the camera team went to have a look at the third group in Karamoja. The Karamojong people are cattle keepers, semi-nomadic, and most of them shy and reserved in their contacts with other people. Their country was semi-desert, and it was easy to see why little attempt could be made at settled cultivation. The camels, however, were quite a surprise to us. They are not wild, but are used as pack animals in these dry regions. It was interesting to see how they made use of their long necks to reach the higher vegetation. The roads got steadily worse, and at times it might have been quicker to walk if it hadn't been for the fact that it was so hot. In places where dried up stream beds crossed the road, there was often a short but steep drop, and this had to be filled in before we could go on. At Napak, we were joined for a time by Karamojong boys from a mission school, and together carried out a great deal of fossil hunting in the sands and gravels which had been washed down the sides of extinct volcanoes some 20 million years ago. This was an area very likely to yield up important evidence about early man. Although we discovered nothing really spectacular, our finds did help to increase knowledge of the mammal distribution. While we were in this area, we were also able to point the way to an important archaeological site, though we did not have the time or the opportunity to study it ourselves on this expedition. In the last phase of the expedition, we camped at Patiko and cleared some of the ramparts and trenches of the fort built there by Sir Samuel Baker when he was campaigning against the slave trade. We discovered a filled-in trench at right angles to this one, probably the extent of the original smaller fort. The loose rocks are the fill-in, and the solid rock on the right is clearly the edge of the old trench. Further excavation gave us information about the extent of the fort, but a dig in Baker's ammunition store yielded only pottery. Before we left the fort, we were honoured with a visit from one of the ministers of the Uganda government, Dr. Lumu, the Minister of Health. Our work was now nearly complete, and we were able to enjoy 2 days' relaxation in the Murchison Falls National Game Park. This was a new experience, not only to the English. The African boys had not seen any wild game before.
Down by the riverside to study war no more. I'm gonna 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 study war no more. I'm gonna.
In contrast to the rest of Uganda, buffalo and hippo and elephant are all very common along the banks of the Nile here. In spite of the apparent calmness of these creatures, they can be dangerous, and we were glad to be looking at them from a substantial launch. We were told that when an elephant flaps his ears, he is annoyed, and the best thing to do is to avoid him. Not so easy when your engine stalls, as ours had at this moment. On all Brathay expeditions, a great deal of importance is attached to results. We had meetings for verbal reports which kept everyone informed about progress, with Dr. Merrick Poznansky on the spot to comment on what had been achieved. Later on came the writing up of all the findings under his guidance and that of Dr. Bill Bishop and his staff at the Uganda Museum. Their inspiration and encouragement has been of tremendous value to us. In our 5 weeks in Africa, we had learned a great deal, not only about the geography of Uganda, we had learned much about human relationships. It was not so much a matter of simply being with people of different backgrounds. The important thing was that we had worked with them and worked on equal terms. Before we left Africa, we had a look at the building of the first road bridge across the Nile in Uganda. Work at this narrow gorge had gone on with the river in flood at 9 feet above its normal level. This looks impressive from the banks, but the effect when seen from a hanging cage with a 2-inch mesh floor was rather terrifying. The Karuma Bridge was one of a number of signs that Uganda was now something more than just a country for explorers. The great hydroelectric station at Owen Falls reminded us that many parts of Uganda had progressed a long way since the days of the discovery of the source of the Nile. Here, they could produce power for the whole of Uganda and even parts of Kenya. The many signs of modern life which we found in the cities will no doubt spread in the years to come to the less developed parts and eventually bring many changes, even to the parts we explored. In spite of all this, we felt we were leaving behind an Africa that needed more than ever before people of all races who had within them a spirit of exploration.
No more crying, no more crying over me, over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.